So every year after this conference, we send out surveys to ask the attendees what they thought of the event. And this has proven to be an extremely humbling exercise. Because in response to the question of what was your favorite part of the day, one of my dearest friends responded, when you got off the stage. And in response to the question of what could have been done differently to make this conference more enjoyable for you, one attendee actually wrote the following: I really enjoyed all the speakers, but that young man's voice kept cracking. In the future, please consider using moderators that are already past puberty. And since at the time, at this very stage, the only other person on was 83-year-old Byron Ween, I presume they were referring to me. And what confirmed my suspicion was another respondent to that same question. They said, for your shorter speakers, consider getting a pedestal. As I could barely see or hear that dark-haired high school boy all day. So I didn't bring a pedestal today, and I hope you'll forgive me, but there is one thing I can promise you, that me being up here right now is the absolute lowest point of the day, and it only gets better from here. Ladies and gentlemen, it's truly a pleasure to welcome you to the annual Prime Quadrant Conference. And each year as I get up here, for my opening remarks, I tend to ask the same 1 or 2 or 3 questions. What are we doing here? What are you doing here? And what's the point of this event? And I think it's worth reviewing what we've said in the past. So, firstly, we're here to learn and expand our minds to the ideas that we'll hear today from some of the greatest investors, best-selling authors, and the brightest minds on the planet. And I'll tell you a quick story. Last year, a woman came to me at the end of the day. I'm going to get to that in housekeeping. A woman came to me at the end of the conference, and she said, Mo, you know, I came here looking for an answer, but I have to tell you, I am leaving more confused than when I came in. To which I responded, fantastic, that's the idea. And, you know, she kind of gave me one of these pitiful looks, that sympathetic smile you give to somebody who just doesn't get it, and gracefully walked away. But I actually meant it. You know, Mark Twain once said that education is the path from confident ignorance to miserable uncertainty. And whether we admit it or not, investing is all about navigating a miserable uncertainty. And some of the ideas you hear today will be very different. Some may even be contradictory, with both compelling arguments on both sides. But the purpose isn't to figure out who is most correct or whose predictions are most accurate. The idea is to expand our thinking about our investing and our world. Secondly, we're here to support 2 world-class institutions in their mission to care and to cure. Both Princess Margaret and University of Toronto Faculty of Medicine are among the top research institutes in the world. And their partnership on GPEC, which is an extraordinary collaboration to address the painful gaps in psychosocial and palliative care. There is no one in this room that hasn't somehow been touched by cancer or terminal illness, and everyone understands how critical it is to provide support, dignity, and care to those who have no choice but to live with illness the rest of their lives. And thirdly, we are here to meet one another. The people in this room are amongst the brightest and most successful Canadians. And today, please don't be shy. Extend a hand, introduce yourselves. The relationships that have been forged at our conferences have proven to be extremely meaningful and fruitful. And so don't miss the opportunity to meet fellow investors and all the people that made this event possible. And that leads me to the thank yous. Firstly, I thank each of you for joining us today and for coming out and supporting these great institutions. And my team and I are tremendously grateful to have had the opportunity to work with Brian Bashan and Sherry Friedman and Andrea Orr and all of the exceptional staff at both U of T and Princess Margaret. And we are especially grateful to each of today's sponsors. Thank you, and thank you. We couldn't do any of this without your generosity, and each of you should be very proud what you are doing for the healthcare community and the investor community in Canada. And for our part, as we at Prime Quadrant are honored to host this event each year and advances our own mission of trying to help the world become a better place and helping our clients make better investment decisions. Now, before we begin our first session, just a couple of housekeeping items. So, first of all, apparently I didn't practice what I preach, but out of respect of all of today's distinguished speakers, please turn off your phone, and somebody's going to have to tell me how to put it on silent. And if you have to take a call, please do so outside. Secondly, you will hear many insights throughout the day. I got a card here somewhere. Throughout the day that could hopefully improve your life and your investing. And each time that happens, especially if you're a guest of somebody here today, please consider expressing your thanks by making a gift to GPEC. So on your table there are these pledge cards, and there's these little containers where you could insert cash, checks, cards, and the volunteers from Princess Margaret will come around throughout the day to collect them. Now, I'm just looking at this card. It seems that the categories are quite humble, because I know everybody in the room wants to give millions to the hospital. But, you know, today, nobody has to be a show-off, so try to constrain yourself to the options provided. But in all seriousness, whatever you do, anything that you do will be greatly appreciated. And by the way, another fun way to give is there's a raffle of wonderful prizes that were donated. Some include diamond and golden earrings and custom-made suit, case of French wine, etc. By the way, speaking of custom-made suit, thanks to the generosity of King and Bay Clothiers, every attendee of this conference can receive a free Italian fabric custom-made shirt. So make sure to avail yourself of that. And lastly, to keep the program running smoothly, I'm going to ask you to avoid one common pitfall. At every conference I've ever been to, no matter how fascinating the speaker or topic, if and when we get to a Q&A section, there's always that awkward silence for the first 15 seconds. And it took me longer to say this than the 15 seconds it will take, but that 15 seconds feels like eternity to the moderator and creates a certain discomfort in the crowd. So to make life easier for everyone, if you're listening, as you're listening, and if you have questions, please write them down in your notebooks so that if and when we get to a Q&A section, the moderator doesn't feel like the only person in the room. So with that, and all of that said, it gives me great pleasure and privilege to invite Mr. Paul Alofs, the President and CEO of Princess Margaret Cancer Foundation, to introduce our first speaker of the day.
Good morning, everyone. Mo, I have to say, you are a force of nature. It's been such a pleasure getting to know you, and to you and to Prime Quadrant, everybody involved in organizing this superb day. Brilliant speakers, and the folks in the audience, this is going to be an absolutely superb day. Mo, to you and Prime Quadrant, thanks from all of us. Thank you. And also, Mo, thank you for making philanthropy part of this day. I know everybody in this room is involved in philanthropy one way or another. Mo, among his many talents, is an author, and he wrote a book called The Philanthropic Mind, and it has brilliant insights into some of the best practices of philanthropists, and I urge you to pick it up and have a read. In terms of philanthropy, the Princess Margaret and the University of Toronto are beneficiaries today of your generosity. And you're going to hear a little bit later about the Palliative Care Center and global work that's being done that your funding is going to go towards. So I know Dean Kathy Whiteside from the University of Toronto is here today, and our colleagues at the U of T who are partnering with us on this end-of-life palliative care mission that we're on. I say thank you to all of you. Now, just very quickly, you're going to hear a lot of numbers here today. Important numbers. In 60 seconds, I have 5 numbers that I'd like you to know about Princess Margaret. Here are the 5 numbers. The first number is 40. The second number is 5. The third number is 1,000. The fourth number is 1 billion. And the fifth and last number is 1. The first number, 40. 40% of Canadians and Americans will be diagnosed with cancer in their lifetime. 40%. The second 40 number, there will be a 40% increase in the number of new cancer cases in the next 15 years, by 2030, a 40% increase. The second number, 5. Princess Margaret is recognized as one of the top 5 cancer research centers in the world. Top 5, right over on University Avenue. That's where your support goes. The third number, 1,000. By the time we get to cocktails this evening, there will be 1,000 patients that have been treated at the Princess Margaret today. Every day, 1,000 patients treated. 200 receive chemotherapy. 67 of some of the world's best cancer surgeons will go to work today. The fourth number, 1 billion. We launched 3 years ago a $1 billion campaign, the most ambitious in Canadian healthcare history, to fund the revolution that's happening in personalized cancer medicine. And I'm happy to say we're $800 million along, and we will finish that $1 billion milestone with the help of people like you. And the last number is 1. Because this is an investors conference, and because this is really important to know about personalized medicine, the single most important opportunity in personalized cancer medicine is called immune therapy. The JP Morgan conference in January in San Francisco, cancer immune therapy was the focus of global pharma. You should also know that a month ago, an ETF, a unique ETF, ticker symbol CNCR, was launched to track 30 of the top pharma companies developing immune therapy treatments for cancer patients. Went public at $25, is trading about $30 today. So important for cancer, and as an investor, you might want to have a look at that ETF if you're interested in immune therapy. Now, I'm absolutely delighted to be here to do a Q&A session with someone who I just met, but with my research tells me you're very much going to enjoy. Actually, Mo reached out to me early on, and he said he'd like me to do a Keystone address, and I said I would make a valiant effort to do a proper introduction. You know, Keystone, Valiant, these are big stories in our world right now, and they both relate in part back to government relations. And the individual that I'm going to introduce this morning is someone that has deep experience in government relations around the world, and I think her experience in the George W. Bush White House is also going to be fascinating to you. I'm very pleased to introduce Candy Wolf. Candy is Citigroup's Executive Vice President and Head of Global Government Affairs. She's responsible for the company's government affairs globally, including U.S. federal and state government relations and international government relations. Previously, Candy served in the White House as Assistant to President George W. Bush for Legislative Affairs and President's Principal Liaison to Congress. She advised the President and his Cabinet on legislative strategy regarding economic, domestic, international, and national security issues. Ms. Wolf also worked for Vice President Cheney as his Head of Legislative Affairs and in the U.S. Senate, serving in senior staff positions in the Republican leadership. Prior to joining Citigroup, among many other prominent roles, Ms. Wolf was a partner at Hogan Lovells, where she represented clients in legislative matters before the Congress and the administration. Ms. Wolf has been named by the National Journal as one of the 25 most influential women in Washington, and also named one of the women to watch by the American Banker Association. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Candy Wolf to the stage. Candy. Candy, a little Bruce Springsteen to make you feel comfortable this morning?
It's probably more appropriate for my age than the earlier music, perhaps for Mo. I said that was a little generational.
Candy, we have about 40 minutes or so. I have so many questions to ask you, but if I could, I'd like to ask you kind of three different themes or segments. Talk about a little bit about your experience in the George W. Bush White House, and then your experience in, I know, a very hot topic for all of us, which is government relations and the importance of it. And then finally, some of your thoughts and outlook on what is going to be certainly one of the most incredible presidential elections coming up in 12 months' time. And we'll squeeze in some other questions on trade and healthcare and other things as we have time.
Perfect.
Okay, and hopefully at the end, if there are some questions from the floor, we'd be happy to take a couple questions from the floor. Now, given your very interesting background experience, law, government, and now to Citigroup, maybe you could just give everyone a little bit of a context, some of the catalysts for your career changes and the passion behind some of the moves that you made.
Yeah, it sort of sounds like it was a little disjointed. Law, consulting, corporation, but it actually all kind of made sense. I went to law school at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and the reason I went to D.C. is because I was an intern, like many folks are, coming out of college, and loved politics and went to work on Capitol Hill and had a great summer. Said, you know, I think of all the places I want to be, Washington sort of seems to be the fit. And went to law school and said, well, I'll focus on tax law. That seemed interesting. It was post-1986. This was the early 90s. They were coming off a lot of changes with tax provisions after Reagan had done the tax reform in 86. And so I thought policy-wise that could be interesting. And then I decided I really needed to understand the politics that was influencing the outcome of these tax changes. So I had the opportunity to go to Capitol Hill and just said, I'll go up for a couple years like everybody in Washington, you know, the revolving door story. You go into government, you come out to the private sector. That's what you do in Washington. And I thought, all right, I'll go for a couple years. Well, 2 years turned into 8, 8 turned into 6 in the Bush administration. I ended up with 14 years in government and then said, now I got to get a real job. And time to come out and come to the private sector. So I was in and out a couple of times, but mostly the legal degree was helpful in the interaction, but it was really understanding the interaction of policy and politics and how the politics influences the policy and how the policy can influence the politics. And it works in both directions. And so all of the different opportunities gave me the growth of, you know, not only just how a bill becomes a law, which is an important part to that process, but also how, you know, how to try to influence the politics, if you will, to get a result. And then I just love politics and the passion of it. It's fabulous. And then Citi is just a great opportunity to translate it to the global, you know, agenda, if you will, the global stage, because in the Bush administration and, of course, in Congress, while you have foreign policy issues, you're not interacting regularly with foreign governments. At least that wasn't my role. My role with Bush was deal with 535 members of Congress and try to figure that out, which has its own level of complication, but not really dealing in the international arena. And so Citi is really that global footprint, particularly for us as a company that does business in 100 countries. And so being able to take that next level of what do I know in the US, how is it applicable, and how is it different, and try to apply those skills. So
great
that's my
background and
story.
experience.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, it seems, and we all know that President Bush and Cheney were polarizing figures in part. Your job dealing with Congress, they were successful in terms of their legislative agenda. They seem to have been much more successful dealing with Congress than President Obama. You want to comment just on the challenges that you see in your job What can you tell us about how that role of the relationship between the President and Congress, how it worked and what you saw, and what are the challenges that President Obama is facing?
Yeah, so the road is rocky or bumpy, no matter who's president at the end of the day, because you're dealing between the U.S. Congress and the presidency, and unlike Prime Minister who has his own parliament and therefore presumably can try to move his own people, the Congress is a little bit like that depending on what your majority is, but the president has to really work to educate a lot of the members to the policy changes. And I think it's always easiest at the beginning of an administration. And I would say that with the Bush administration early on. You know, you could go to Capitol Hill and you could say, well, the president really needs this, and there was a coalescing behind it. You know, you have to have a policy argument, but it was a little bit easier to say, you know, this is important to the president's policies, program, and you could kind of get the votes. That was true for about 2 years. After that, it got far more complicated. And I think President Obama found, you know, the first 2 years is when he got his agenda through. It was Obamacare, Dodd-Frank, a lot of the changes because he had a majority of he had the Congress, and of course he had the presidency. Bush had that for much of his term until 2006. And I was there for the switch when it became a Democrat Congress and a Republican president. And then it got more complicated to get things through. It also got more complicated even within your own party, because the longer you're there, you know, the less influential you can be, the more your poll numbers drop, the harder it is to get things through. And, you know, members start to say, well, you're a weight. And if you're a political weight, then why am I going to support you? And it isn't just well, the president really needs this. It's, well, how's it going to affect me? How's it going to affect my vote in my district or my state? And there's a lot more justification for it. But I also think it's about the outreach. And I've had these conversations with President Obama's team as well at different stages. And I was the first woman to have the job. President Obama's now selected a woman that runs legislative affairs. And, you know, I think maybe it's just the style or the thinking around it. It's like, well, bring everybody together, at least let's have a conversation. And sometimes the conversation can lead to a result, sometimes it doesn't. But when times got tough, we had to get more creative around the type of outreach. And so we would have members of Congress and their spouses come to what we call the Yellow Oval, which is in the living quarters of the White House. So the working part of the White House is, and the visiting part of the White House goes through the state dining room, which is the second floor, but you go up to the third level, and that's where the family lives, and they have the Yellow Oval. It's a lovely room. It's an oval shape, and it looks out on the balcony, the Truman balcony that you see in all the pictures, and it's also the Lincoln bedroom up there, the infamous Lincoln bedroom under the Clinton era, but it's been redone, and we had all these members and their staff come, and not their staff, excuse me, members and their spouses, and just have a reception, cocktail hour, get to know you. Very bipartisan. Try to keep building those relationships. And look, Bush never loved it. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's not like, you know, he was just, oh, I can't wait to go meet with Congress. He could wait, and he'll tell you he would prefer not to be there. But he did it, and he put the time in, and I think that's really the effort. You've got to build that personal relationship as technology takes over, as whether it's members of Congress or members of the Parliament get more attuned to not having to talk to their colleagues and only have to look at what's being sent to them through technology. You lose that rapport, and therefore you don't realize that someone has cancer, that there's a family member that you know that there's personal issues, and that personalization, I think, has diminished. It might be one of the reasons that we're seeing some of the polarization that occurs in the political arena, because you don't have that individual rapport and you don't build those bridges and try to work across the aisle, because you don't have to, because technology says, well, I don't have to show up to find out when a vote's going to happen. A long answer to your question.
No, that's a great answer. Just before we move on from your experience in the Bush White House, is there one story or one moment in time that you kind of feel most proud of in terms of something that was accomplished?
Well, I like to tell this story, and it's actually relevant now as we look at TPP and the trade agreement, because early on in my tenure, it was 2005, we had CAFTA, the free trade agreement with the Caribbean, and it had to get through through the Congress, and we knew it was going to be tough. And trade agreements, and this was a Congress that was run by and controlled by the Republicans, so for the most part you expect them to be free traders, but there was sugar concerns, there were dairy concerns, there's always something in the agricultural arena that creates issues with respect to trade agreements. And so I was told, well, the first part of the story is I got yelled at. It was then Bob Zoellick. And he just reamed me out in a meeting and said, because I said, well, we're down 85 votes. So how are we going to move this? I'm down 85. I need 218 in the House. Okay, that's just a math equation. You just have to add it up and get to the number to get to a majority. And he goes, well, you'll never get there if you don't try. And I said, well, we need to get a little closer before we decide we're going to move the bill, because you got a certain time limit, clock starts, and all of a sudden you better have the votes. And so I'd like to know that we're a little closer. So Bush calls me in and he said, I think we do have to move. And I said, well, then we're going to need you to engage. So he said, okay, and he spent more time, and we really kind of focused on the geopolitical aspects of it. About 3 months later, we're ready to really push the vote. So it's gone through the various committees, and now we're ready to go to the floor. And we had members down all the time talking about problems. We're trying to figure out how to get the deals. We're trying to put people together. It's a lot of sausage making, not always pleasant, but a lot of sausage making. And so I tell this story. We go to the Senate is the easy part. So the House, we're going into the vote, and we knew we were down 15 votes on the day of the vote. And in the House of Representatives, somehow, I'm not sure it's the case today. Actually, I wouldn't say it was the case today. But at the time, it was the ability of leadership to deliver votes, and they could deliver them. And so we said, 15 is manageable. So the day of the vote, you're trying to find the 15, and we're figuring they're going to kind of come along, and so you're working it all day. And then we go into the vote, and Bush is really interested, but it's getting to his bedtime. He was notorious for getting into bed by like 9:30. And I'm like, well, Mr. President, you can, I said, I think we're going to get this done, but, we'll get a message to you. And he said, yeah, keep me posted. Well, I go into the House, and I go to the floor in this antechamber to try to see where the votes are going to be as the vote's going forward. And Bush calls me, and I'm like, okay, I didn't expect him. It's like 9:30, 10 o'clock at night. And he wants a running commentary of what's happening. And I'm trying to figure out how we're going to get these votes, and he's telling me I got to give him, what's happening, and I'm trying to explain what's happening. And finally I'm like, sir, you just need to talk to these people. And I would just keep handing my cell phone to the members that were still stuck, and we're still stuck. And then I finally said, I think we're going to get there. It's going to take this one person who's going to have to switch his vote, but we're going to get there. And then my cell phone starts to die. And I'm like, I'm going to lose the President of the United States. What do I do? And I said, I may lose you. I'm losing connection, but I said, we're going to get it. And then we won it by one vote, and that was you just feel relieved at the end of the process. There's just a lot of pressure and an accomplishment in what we thought was, an agreement that was right for the country, was right for the geopolitical environment. And so, it was a huge accomplishment. But there's always some funny stories that are associated with it, and just some good reminders of how tough it is to go get a trade agreement through.
Well, somehow I can't imagine saying to the President of the United States, my battery ran out on my cell phone. Wow. But anyway, I'd like to now switch to your role as EVP and Head of Global Affairs at Citi. Since 2008, obviously, the regulatory environment, particularly in the U.S., has changed so much. What is your job, or what is the job like of someone who heads up for a large global bank, heads up government affairs, and how has it changed since 2008?
Yeah. It's changed a lot since 2008. I had some former colleagues that were in my seat, actually, at Citi, my predecessors. So I kind of knew all the stories. I came in post-crisis, so I started at Citi in 2011, which, was sort of told, oh, we're coming out of the crises, things are good, stock prices going up. This was second quarter 2011. By third quarter 2011, we were going back down, and it got pretty difficult after that. And I think it was an early recognition of the continued challenges that large banks, like universal banks, if you will, like a Citi faces, because there was such a lack of trust, and there still remains a lack of trust. And I think in the geopolitical climate that we're in, you can see it in the US, where banks are still part of the conversation. Okay, let me clarify that. Large Wall Street banks are still part of the conversation. Community and small banks are liked Main Street bank's good, Wall Street bank's bad. That's kind of how the black and white comes out, or big bad, small good. And part of that discussion is even in the 2016 presidential election. So we're almost 8 years out, 7 years out, and there's still a question around trust. There's still a question around, what is the role of bank, the size of banks, and those challenges. And we've seen it in the U.S. and been working through issues, regulatory issues associated with it globally. Particularly true in Europe, as we've seen the deleveraging and the continued pressure on banks politically in the UK, and then through the European Commission. And maybe less so in Asia and less so in LATAM for different reasons. But as I look at the issues, it's been regulatory, and we're trying to get some certainty into the process. We're trying to, we want to be able to operate in a business model that we know what the outcome is. And there's still a question around where the outcome's headed. I think in the US with Dodd-Frank, a lot of those issues, the regulations are coming to conclusion with the current release of total loss observancy capital, TLAC. That provision is going to, I think, get us closer to completion around what's the existing Dodd-Frank rules. But the question is there more to come? Is the geopolitical environment such that there's continued pressure and there's real questions around size and around model? We hope not. We think we have the right model, but those questions keep arising. And then we have other things outside of the regulatory that keep us awake. I mean, some of the top of mind issues, certainly with our CEO and other banks, is cyber. I mean, cybersecurity, the cost of cyber, the privacy issues that are associated with cyber, and then tax. So, OECD's got proposals out around BEPS, base erosion profit plans. It's global, and it could affect interest allocation that affects banks. And so, you've got some of these broader issues that are driven in part by the geopolitical environment of a lot more protectionism, a lot more focus post-crises, sort of inward looking and making sure that the crisis doesn't happen again, have the stability, and then really kind of keep control on the banks. And so, it's a tough environment. And that's before we get to the rest of the geopolitical environment that we're all operating in, the economic environment in which we operate. And so I think there's been a host of challenges. And as I look out in my job, it's to try to identify what those trends are, try to understand them, because I think the only way you can really appreciate what's going to happen in a regulatory environment is to understand the political environment in which the regulators are operating. And I think that piece has been the disconnect previously. It was always pre-crises, well, I can just look at what's happening with my regulators and I'll just deal with them. Well, the regulators, they'd all love to admit that they're independent, are influenced by the political environment in which they operate. And so, there's a response that comes there. And so it's kind of assessing all those issues and figuring out what are some strategies and proposals and best practices that you can put into play. Because there's no such thing as a global government affairs program, right? I mean, I have global issues, but it's country by country. Sometimes you play whack-a-mole, and you sort of have to figure out what are the countries that matter most from a business perspective. What are the ones that are really going to be the countries that are going to drive outcome and changes? So am I worried about some really small country, in Africa? No. But am I worried about China? Yes. Am I worried about Indonesia? Yes. Do we worry about what's happening in Japan? Yes. Do we worry, potentially about Canada? Yes. I mean, bigger markets that could have, an impact on how Citi does its business.
Right. Cybersecurity, there's lots of regulation around too big to fail. But can I ask you a question about cybersecurity? Yeah. Is there collaboration between the major international and global banks around cybersecurity, and is there a collaborative effort with governments around the world, or is it the whack-a-mole approach you mentioned?
It's a little whack-a-mole now. I think, in the U.S., there's a cyber bill that's trying to get done that's going to have more information sharing between companies and government with protection, liability protection, which is a big part. It's a question of what can happen with data. I mean, banks are data companies, right? That's what we are these days. And when you move data, you have to worry about the various privacy laws. And Europe, as we know, has very strict privacy restrictions. And the US is a little more flexible, and Asia is probably somewhere in between, depending on the country. And so as countries kind of look at cyber, and they realize that they may need policies in place, they're struggling with the question of what do we require of companies to ensure that there aren't hacks. And in some cases, we're seeing more protectionist policies that say, well, you need to put your data, keep your data onshore, because we want to have access to it. Well, some of the arguments around that are, well, you have third-party actors who have cyber attacks, and then you have your own employees who are part of that risk. And you need to be able to look at the computers and the information flow of employees to determine if, in fact, information is flowing out of a company's infrastructure. And if you foreclose the ability to get access to that data and information, because some of that in Europe in particular is a challenge, then that's not really advancing cyber and the dialogue. And so we're just now starting to see Europe and Asia, different countries in Asia, begin to have a dialogue around cyber. And I think they have a ways to go. In the US, there's an existing voluntary relationship with the banks to help to share information and be aware of the various attacks. And now the sharing is going to be closer between the industry and the government as a result of the law. And I think we've got to figure out how we can translate that. That's one of my objectives for 2016, is how do we get that translated in a more global marketplace so that you can figure out how this information is shared, but not have a Snowden fear, right? I mean, the US is facing that as a result of Snowden, and this notion that government's going to be holding a lot of information, but at the same time, you've got to balance that need to protect consumers by also having to probably give up a little bit in order to do that, because in the end, it's the consumer data, right, that still needs to be protected from the hacking. And there's a lot more to come. I think it's a current struggle, and there really isn't a coordinated global plan. A lot more discussion at the regulator and at the political policy level, but not something that I think is well organized yet.
Okay. Kenny, I've got a question for you on due diligence. In Canada, there's been an awful lot written recently about the Keystone Pipeline decision. This has really dominated affairs here in terms of the dialogue. And also Valiant Pharmaceuticals has been viewed in part, the failure or the difficulties they're going through, in part about government affairs and public relations. Government affairs and public relations seem to be more of a strategic issue for investors. And yet, I really wonder about, as an investor, how do you do proper due diligence on whether a company has good, strong, great government relations? For all the investors in the room here, what advice could you give on how to do due diligence on whether a company actually has strong government relations?
Well, it's a bit of a hard call from the due diligence. I would say, look at Citi, we put a lot of disclosures on our website in terms of what our political activities are. There's a statement around what we do. We have, in the US, you can make political contributions under a political action committee. It's voluntary employee money pooled under the Federal Election Commission rules. And so we do have a PAC, and we do disclose. And I think first of all, I think you've got to take the perspective that a company should have lobbying. Granted, I'm a lobbyist by trade. Okay, I've got the big L. I'm the lawyer. I'm the lobbyist. It's like, and I'm proud of it. But a lot of people shy away from this notion that lobbying is this bad term. And maybe you call it advocacy, maybe you call it education, but it's a way to educate government officials who do not have the time to focus on all of the details, who are spread thin, particularly when it comes to legislation with not enough staff to understand the implications of their actions on the marketplace or on the decisions that they're making. So if they're crafting legislation, they ought to at least understand what impact it's going to have. They can choose to either take it or leave it, or make sure that they have both sides available to them to understand what are the pros and cons to any argument that's being put forward. But I think if I were looking out at it, I want to know, does a company have a lobbying shop? And if you do, and certainly in the US or elsewhere, some of it's under registration requirements. Some of it's just understanding if there's something on the website and kind of asking questions. Even go to the annual meeting and ask what's out there. I guess if you don't have the investment, you can't go to the annual meeting to begin with, but there should be some publicly disclosed information around it. The two cases that you put forward, I think, the hard part is they're at the heart of the presidential campaign now. Keystone was part of that. and drug pricing is now front and center. And we'll see. There's a Democrat debate on Saturday. I've been asked this by others, kind of like how much more on the drug pricing. I think there's definitely more to come. It appeals to the populism that's going on in the U.S. It appeals to the fairness argument and protect consumers. And so it's unfortunately, as you kind of look at some of these decisions, have we looked at the the political environment in which we're trying to make the decision and be able to weigh it to say, is this the right timing? Because you have to understand the mood of a country, or at least what's underlying it, enough to say this could be a hot button issue. And I don't know kind of where ultimately the issue will play out. I think you'll see, we didn't see it with Republicans getting asked these questions in the last debates, but I think more and more as Hillary Clinton makes drug pricing a higher priority issue for her, where does it go? Do Republicans try to glom on? If it's viewed as too high, then they may feel the need to say something, even though they wouldn't want price controls. So I think there's going to be some, like I said, more to come, I think, on the issue of drug pricing. But from a due diligence perspective, it's see if you can find some things on the website, get an understanding. Sometimes there's issues that are out there where, certain issues might be listed as things that they work on. Because we have lobbying disclosure in the U.S., it's a good way to figure out what they're doing, because all of it's public information. You have to do a little bit of hunting, but you can find what issues we lobby on a quarterly basis. Now, in Canada, I'm not as familiar with kind of if there's a registry or a transparency part to it that would make it more readily apparent as to what people are working on. But that's kind of some of the tools that might be available. Other countries, a lot harder.
Right. Okay, great, thank you. Disruptive technologies. So many sectors are being disrupted by bold innovators from outside of the sector. Financial services. What is Citigroup looking at? What is Citigroup either concerned about or focused on in terms of the disruptive technologies over the next 5 to 10 years? And what is your role within the whole kind of government relations, legislative side of things to try to focus on either these opportunities or threats?
So financial technology, fintech as we call it, is kind of the new buzzword. And the disruptive technologies are peer-to-peer lending. It's mobile banking, it's eBay, it's Apple Pay, it's using technology as a way to do your banking. It's the fact that the millennials don't show up at a branch and everything's online. It's it's a lot of the startups where you can operate and make payments outside of the regular payment structure of a bank, if you will. And at Citi, we've seen it. I mean, people have kind of seen it coming, but whether you're a highly regulated company, it's a lot harder to make the changes. And so we just announced the structuring of a new group, a fintech group inside Citi, that's going to turn it into a Silicon Valley, is the hope, to have almost a venture capitalist mentality, because you've got to know when you got to fail quickly or you got to succeed quickly, and you got to see if there's technologies and options out there to make banking more mobile, more digital, and more consumer and user-friendly, right? I mean, you all like the apps and certain apps because they're user-friendly. Well, banking needs to figure out how it's going to be user-friendly and convenient, but also provide security, which is the other part to this, to not have, because a lot of the hacks that occur happen in the credit card space often, and because you don't have a card present. So when you're doing your online banking, you can get challenges. It's a card not present as opposed to a card present as we move into more of a chip system, and tokenization and other options that are out there to protect payments. So what I look at is, where's the regulatory environment for that? So interestingly enough, and if I were them, I would have done it. Apple and Facebook and Google and eBay have all started a new lobbying group in Washington to focus on fintech. And so they see themselves as disruptors. They see themselves as interested in being in the business of payments and movement of payments. And so, I have to look at it and say, okay, how are they going to advocate? What do we advocate? How do we show that we have a technology and still be part of the process, and then it's probably going to come down to a regulatory environment. I mean, some regulators are going to want to try to regulate the tech community, others are not. There's going to be a huge battle over it at some point, and so it's a little bit on the early stages. I think it's more a question of what is Citi going to do? Where's the technology going first before you can figure out the legislative and regulatory environment, but you can start to begin to see that dialogue, and I think 2016 is a year when it'll begin a discussion from a policy perspective, and probably 2017 is when things start getting off the ground and regulators and governments start to kind of focus on it. Because it's also a great way, technology is a way to have financial inclusion. If you look at Kenya, and Kenya's a good example. Philippines have been doing a little bit. India, they've expanded financial inclusion by having it through not a smartphone, but your older phone systems, and be able to transfer payments so that you can get out of a cash society. And so, India, Modi just put a number of new bankers. How many million, 100+ million people that got bank accounts as a consequence of using the technology and on the phone, and so he was able to set this up. And so I think the technology space can move in many different directions. Some of it from an inclusion perspective for countries in emerging markets that are looking to have more people in the banking system, and then from a disruptor perspective, which is how do we get outside of the bank as a third party, right. And can we get rid of an intermediary and therefore get rid of a layer of cost? And that's going to be the challenge going forward. And I think banks need to embrace it. They need to figure out how to get in front of it. They need to put investment in it because it's seen as a disruptor. I have to say, just as my own personal opinion, I do have a bit of skepticism around how far something like peer-to-peer lending and some of these other options really go. Can they really take off to the point that they're going to be a huge dominating part of the market, or do people just traditionally at the end of the day want a more traditional bank lending model? And some of that will depend on the regulations, right? Are we able to lend? And what are going to be the FICO scores in which we can do it, and who's going to be credit worthy in an environment with very tight regulations? And I think that's where a lot of this has been pushed into the shadow market, for lack of any better term, if you want to call the disruptor shadow market. But all those trends will need to continue to play out as we see where the regulatory environment ultimately settles out for banks, and whether the pendulum starts to shift a little bit more down to what I would say would be more equilibrium, or is they still going to stay up higher on the safety and soundness, and therefore make lending even more difficult and put more challenges, and therefore give the disruptors more room.
So I know Citi's got a different model for branch banking, but Canadian banks, American banks, so many banks around the world still have massive investments in real estate and branches. How long will the branch banking system be around, the bricks and mortar of banking?
Well, I'm far from the expert on that. I think at Citi, we've shrunk our footprint to be in basically 6 cities in the U.S., with a recognition that we didn't have that footprint, as big a footprint as many of our competitors. And so we kept to kind of what we do best as we had to simplify post-crises. And it was really focusing in some urban centers and cities, and then looking out into cities around the globe. We call it the Cities for Cities plan, for a little umbrella. But as we looked at technology, and we tested some things in Singapore, where we have what we call our smart, we have smart branches, but we also have smart ATMs, and a lot of them are going to be where you can speak directly into what you would envision like a small little booth, like an ATM booth, and have a face-to-face conversation with a customer service rep or someone from a bank. So you're not going to have these big retail operations. It's moving. You can use technology to shrink things and yet still be able to have a dialogue. And then, of course, whatever you can do online and with the rest of your phone, and et cetera. And the goal is to try to get it all linked in a way that will really talk to each other, and therefore, know all of the customer services and needs. And, I think it is costly, and you see it. A lot of the banks have really started to downsize, and you have to figure out where your competition is going to be and what makes sense, and where to locate, because it is costly. And that's, true in all the big urban areas and cities where, better off with an ATM or some kind of small booth than you are with some bigger space that's just going to be a huge amount of burden on real estate.
Right. Last 15 minutes, with your experience in the White House, I'd like to focus on the future, both in terms of American politics as well as banking. So let me ask you a tough question. It's November the 5th, 2016, and you're in your old job, whoever is president of the United States at that point. Where would you start off in terms of relationship with Congress and trying to move forward a legislative agenda that really seems to have been stopped up during the Obama years?
Well, some of that will depend on who wins, and then what agenda they've campaigned on, and kind of the key issues, and then the campaign will turn into a transition, and the transition will then turn into, well, we need to have a State of the Union, and the State of the Union will be that platform, if you will, of what to move. But I think early on, having some outreach to the Congress. Now, the one challenge for any new president coming in, and it depends on who wins the presidency, the Congress has the potential of shifting, particularly the Senate. So if a Democrat, most likely Hillary Clinton, were to win the White House, then it is a strong likelihood that the Senate will flip from Republican to Democrat. So she would be operating with a Democrat Senate and a Republican House, which is similar to what President Obama has had to operate with since 2010. Until 2014, and then it flipped to Republican. If a Republican is elected president, then the Senate is expected to stay Republican. And the reason I say that is because there are a number of seats of the US Senate that are up for election that are in the key presidential battleground states. And voters don't usually split their ballot. So if you're voting for the Democrat at the top of the ticket, you tend to vote for the Democrat mid-ticket around the Senate races. And the Republicans are at risk of losing the Senate as a result of the number of seats that they have up in battleground states such as Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida, Nevada, just a lot of seats out. So then I think the challenge becomes one of, well, what's the makeup of that Congress? And the type of outreach you have to do, which is who's going to be chairman? And who do we get in to begin a dialogue and a conversation and get some sense from them what their issues are going to be, what they would like to talk about, and maybe be able to pull in what Congress is interested in doing into what the White House ultimately wants to do, so that you at least begin a dialogue, so that you have some sense of maybe there's some issues that have some bipartisanship, and figure out how you prioritize them. So it's a lot of information gathering and a lot of communication and in early dialogue to see if you can bring people along. Excuse me. Keep moving my Italian hands. The wolf part's the German, but I'm 100% Italian, so I start to get my hands going here. And anyway,
Okay.
I think a dialogue.
So let's get really specific about the candidacy of Hillary Clinton. I see that Bernie Sanders raised as much money, donations, as Hillary Clinton last quarter. What is going on with the Hillary Clinton candidacy, and is anybody going to step forward to run against her?
I think Biden was the one person on the Democratic side to kind of be out there and really put a challenge. I mean, Sanders is unique in that he's appealing to a very populist base in the same way that Trump and Carson appeal on the Republican side. There is a real outsider viewpoint in the US, and I think if you characterize, you've got outsider candidates and insider candidates. And Bernie Sanders, even though he's been a congressman and a senator for a very long time, relatively speaking, is still viewed as an outsider, whereas Hillary Clinton is viewed as the insider and therefore so-called establishment. You have Trump, Carson, Fiorina, and I would even put Ted Cruz to some extent in as the outsiders. And then you kind of get the Rubio, Bush, Kasich, Christie, somewhere else I'm missing in there for who's ever still left in that group, as the insider. And part of where the outsiders are really generating the enthusiasm right now is the voter anger. And the anger is, I wouldn't say it was just, it's anger and that's a secondary outcome of fear and frustration and anxiety. And so how does that anxiety, either about the economy or about your own personal situation or health or family and security, all kind of gets translated into this level of anger for different reasons. And so, Bernie Sanders has gained traction in key states like Iowa and New Hampshire that are big battleground states in the US. I don't think you look at any of the numbers, long term it's not sustainable for him. I think he can get the enthusiasm in the short term. He may do really well in a couple of places, but in the end, the money and the machine is Clinton's. And I think as you move out of some of these more activist states, it's harder for Sanders to keep the appeal. So, it's hard to imagine a situation where Hillary Clinton isn't the Democrat nominee, even though she's going to have these blips and she's really going to have to respond to what Bernie Sanders is saying and really to the platform that he's putting forward, because he has an appeal with an activist base that matters for the primary.
So obviously you have a relationship with the Bush family. So the George W., and our current candidate, they meet up in Kennebunkport on the weekend and they have a conversation. What's going on with Jeb Bush? Why
Sure
is he fallen so far back? And is he going to, we have some very, let's say, alternative candidates on the Republican side. Who is going to end up being the nominee in your view? And what happened to Jeb Bush?
Well, that's an easy layup question. The good thing about this time of the year is you can't be totally wrong, because you're trying to figure out, no one's quite certain where any of this is going. And I think the field for Republicans being as large as it is has made it so difficult. And I would say, maybe harken back to your own election here, the polling is very difficult. So take it for what it is, because I think polling has changed significantly. People don't answer their phones anymore, right? I certainly don't on a landline. If you have a landline and they're not doing cell phone calls, and therefore you have to do some online. So I think it's very difficult to figure out what really is a national mood. I think maybe the polls in particular states are better at determining where people stand. So a couple of things I would say about who could be the nominee, and then to the point about Jeb. In terms of the nominations, Trump obviously has been high in the national polls. Ben Carson's been coming up in them. He's beating out Trump in a couple of key battleground states, or at least in Iowa, and getting pretty close in New Hampshire. I think you got to look at number 3s and number 4s in there. So they're now doing polling that who's your first choice, your second choice, your third choice, and your fourth choice. And sort of where do the 2s and 3s and 3s and 4s add up? And because Trump, if you look at some of the other numbers about voter perception, there's still a dating game going on. Okay, there's a lot of this, I'm dating this person, I'm not sure I'm going to wed them. And if they're not going to have a wedding, then where are you going to go and what candidate do you eventually get to? And there's still voters making decisions, even though you get these national polls with really strong appeal. If you go into some of the focus group testing, particularly around Trump, you'll find that there's some really committed voters, and then there's a lot of people who just like the entertainment factor. So I still believe that has historically been true, and this election could prove us all wrong. So I'm going to just, I'll call it for what it is. I could be 100% wrong when I get done with this, but the elections have always played out that the so-called sort of insider establishment candidate at the end of the day sort of wins. But the question is going to be how does it sort of winnow down? And I actually see Ted Cruz kind of coming through as more of the outsider candidate who gets higher appeal ultimately than Trump, who I think whose numbers start to tank now, and long term, I'm not sure he's sustainable. The more Carson comes up, the more his numbers are going to drop, because he's going to get under attack. And then you've got somebody like Cruz, who's been a bit of a sleeper. He's got the money, he has the apparatus, and he can pull the votes from the red states that are some of the same people that Ben Carson's really been pulling from. And then the issue comes, okay, now you get sort of who's the insider candidate. I think the two sort of credible ones left, for those who like Kasich and Christie, my apologies, I think they kind of fall off. So you're sort of Bush maybe, and then Rubio. And you could have something that comes down to the 40-somethings again, because the U.S. shifted generationally, and in the same way that Canada shifted generationally to 40-year-olds in prime minister or presidential. And we've seen tracking or information that different pollsters have put together that age does matter, that once you shift a generation, you don't go back. And this is a potential challenge for Hillary Clinton from an age perspective, although the fact that she's a woman may overcome that piece, maybe. But, you know, are we really going to go to somebody who's in their 60s or 70s, or late 60s, early 70s? Or are we going to try to stay with a younger generation? And that's where the 40-somethings come out. And Jeb's challenge has been, look, he had the money, he had everything coming out, but he also knew that he hadn't campaigned in 12, 13 years, and it's a different environment. You better be able to speak in a Twitter soundbite or a Twitter, you know, statement or a soundbite that's 30 seconds and be able to do blogs, and that's not his style. He is a policy guy, and he gets in the weeds, and you see it in the debates. He can't get himself out into those soundbites that somebody like Rubio has been able to do, and the candidates who are out there now and the younger candidates have all been challenged in that environment in which the media and the soundbites have really played an important part of their campaign. I'm not counting Jeb out yet. I think it'll come down to where the money starts to flow. I mean, if the money, not to be crass, but you know, that's where the apparatus and kind of the infrastructure within the U.S. ultimately goes. And if the money, if the big dollar individual investors, which is where most of the U.S. election is going to be funded, is going to flow into a Rubio, then it means it's flowing from Bush, or it never went to Bush. And a couple of the big hedge fund folks and others have kind of come in. You know, Paul Singer just went in for Rubio, which was something that he's putting his money kind of on the Rubio campaign. And if more of those dollars kind of flow, then I think it's a bigger risk for Jeb that he can stay in, because he's going to have to put in infrastructure in place. And you know, remember, in the U.S., it's not a national election. It's a state election, and there's only 10 states, and really at the end of the day, only 7 states that matter for the vote, because 40 out of 50 states in the United States have voted for the same party candidate for the last 100 years. So there are 18 states in the District of, or in the century, excuse me, in the century. So 18 states in the District of Columbia have gone Democratic, and they're equal to 242 electoral votes. And on the Republican side, there's 22 states, but only about 180 electoral votes. And so if you're paying attention to politics and the one states that you want to care about, and if you're anywhere traveling, you may want to stay out of Florida, Ohio, Virginia, Nevada, Colorado, because right now the TV ads will be overwhelming in terms of where the candidates, you're just going to be bombarded. And then you get Iowa, New Hampshire, North Carolina, maybe. They throw Indiana in, but I don't buy that. And there was one more in there that's not as strong. So, you know, the U.S., yes, there's a national election, but it's because it's electoral votes, because it matters in certain states, and there's only a handful that remain swing states.
Okay, last question. Got to ask a question about Donald Trump. I think if Molinsky was running the Donald Trump campaign, he's going to be the next president of the United States. Mo, if you were running the campaign, that would be it. But as investors, what does this seemingly serious candidacy of Donald Trump, what's the insight for investors? What can we take away as individuals who want to try to draw beyond the anger that he's obviously attracting? What is it about his candidacy that is so appealing to so many Americans? And as an investor, what's the insight?
So what's appealing is he's viewed as authentic. He's viewed as not just, I think a lot of the frustration has been politicians make promises and they can't deliver on it. And so there's this notion it's a pox on all your houses and we should just blow up Washington and get rid of it and start over, because then maybe there'll be some change. And a lot of the appeal for Trump is he says it like it is. You know, hey, I'm out there. He sounds like me. He's saying it like it is. And that's true of Bernie Sanders. He's saying it like it is. I like hearing that. And to some extent, Ben Carson. And they don't seem tainted with all of these establishment issues and worrying about the politics. And so, you know, I think that's where Trump has the appeal. But he's also a great entertainer. I mean, my gosh, you know, we did have Ronald Reagan, but at least he had gotten elected as governor and ran a few times. I'm hoping that, you know, maybe experience will matter a little bit in the process, and I have faith in the American voter long term. But that's my personal view. I'm not a Donald Trump fan, I'll say that. Not a city position, although I suspect if I asked, we might get some of that same from some of the seniors. But
Candy, our time's up. Thank you so much for being here. Candy Wolf, Citigroup, Executive Vice President, Head of Global Government Affairs. Candy, thank you.